The house was still quiet when the financial reality of it began to surface, not through emotion, but through the ordinary, repetitive structure of bills that most people ignore until they become impossible to separate from ownership. Mortgage statements arrived monthly, insurance renewals followed seasonal cycles, grocery expenses stacked in predictable patterns, and car notes pulled from accounts with mechanical consistency that never asked for permission from anyone's opinion. On the surface, it looked like a normal American household, but underneath it was a system of financial dependencies that required precision, documentation, and an understanding of who was actually sustaining what. The young white American woman had learned to read that system long before anyone decided to question her presence in it. While others spoke in assumptions about who belonged, who contributed, and who had authority, she was tracking numbers, reviewing statements, and noticing patterns in cash flow that most people only see when something breaks. She did not appear powerful in the way people expected power to look. There was no loud confidence, no public display of wealth, no need to perform control. Instead, there was something far more dangerous in financial disputes: comprehension without noise. She understood which accounts the mortgage was drawn from, how insurance was structured around ownership records, and how credit obligations quietly defined responsibility even when no one was paying attention. Grocery bills did not impress anyone, but they revealed habits of dependency. Car notes did not create status, but they revealed who was carrying long-term liability. And credit cards, more than anything, revealed who was temporarily surviving and who was structurally stable. She never needed to argue about these things because she had already mapped them in silence. The quiet white billionaire mentor observed all of this from a distance that felt almost disconnected from the emotional tension in the house. He was not there to intervene or correct anyone. His presence functioned more like a reminder that financial systems do not respond to group opinion. Dressed in a restrained, high-quality suit that revealed nothing but suggested everything, he moved through the environment like someone accustomed to separating perception from enforceable reality. When he glanced at the living situation, he did not see conflict first. He saw structure, documentation, and potential misalignment between what people believed and what the records would eventually confirm. What the others interpreted as weakness in the young woman was actually a form of financial discipline they did not recognize. She did not argue because she did not need to. In her mind, arguments were irrelevant when paperwork already existed. The real power was not in convincing others. It was in being able to produce something they could not dismiss. That distinction separated emotional ownership from legal ownership, even if the people around her had not yet realized it. The tension in the house continued to build, but not because anything had changed physically. It grew because uncertainty had entered the system. Whenever people realized that belief and documentation were not aligned, they began to search for certainty in the wrong places: tone of voice, confidence, social support. But none of those things appear on a deed. And somewhere, quietly waiting beyond the noise of accusations and assumptions, was the one thing no one had fully confronted yet: the document that would not argue, would not negotiate, and would not care who believed what. It simply existed. And once it was opened, the entire structure everyone thought they understood would have to adjust to what had always been written inside it. What unfolded inside that house was not just a conflict over space or emotion, but a collision between two completely different financial belief systems, one built on appearance and the other built on structure. And in moments like this, most people reveal a set of assumptions they never question until they cost them something real. The first false belief is that the person who is quiet is the one who is weak. The second is that the person who does not display wealth must not have any. The third is that being physically inside a house automatically translates into ownership of it. The fourth is that income equals stability, and therefore equals control. And the fifth, perhaps the most dangerous, is that emotion can override documentation. These beliefs do not appear irrational on the surface. In fact, they are reinforced constantly in everyday social environments. People trust what they can see. They respond to confidence, tone, and social validation more than they respond to paperwork they have never read. But finance does not operate on perception. It operates on recorded structure. And that is where the gap begins to widen. Looking rich is not the same as owning assets. Looking in control is not the same as having legal authority. Monthly payments create the illusion of participation, but they do not automatically create ownership. Loud accusations feel powerful in the moment, but they collapse instantly when confronted with quiet documents that were signed long before the argument began. This is the part of financial reality most people avoid thinking about, because it removes emotion from the center of decision-making and replaces it with structure. The young white American woman understood this distinction in a way that unsettled everyone around her precisely because she did not behave like someone trying to win a social argument. She behaved like someone who already knew where the outcome was recorded. While others relied on interpretation, she relied on documentation. While others escalated emotion, she tracked structure. And while others assumed control could be taken through pressure, she understood that control in real estate and financial systems is only as flexible as the name on a title. The quiet white billionaire Minter observed this divide without commentary. To him, none of this was unusual. In his world, wealth was never defined by who spoke the loudest in a room, but by who could prove continuity of ownership when challenged. He had seen people lose entire properties not because they lacked money, but because they misunderstood what money actually translates into under legal systems. Cash flow can maintain a lifestyle, but it does not define entitlement. Only recorded ownership does. So the real question begins. To shift away from emotion. It is no longer about who feels wronged, or who appears justified in the eyes of others. The question becomes much simpler and much more uncomfortable. What actually exists on paper when everything else is stripped away? Because in financial disputes like this, perception is always the first thing to collapse when structure enters the room. And that structure was already waiting, quietly positioned behind the noise of arguments and assumptions. A set of documents, recorded over time, signed without attention from those who now believed they had authority. What no one realized yet was that the entire situation was not being decided in real time. It had already been decided the moment those records were created. The only thing left was the moment when someone would finally open them. To understand what was happening inside that house, you have to step away from emotion and look at the basic structure of how money actually behaves in real life. Most people think financial control comes from effort, or from who pays the most visible bills, or from who speaks with authority in a household. But in reality, money follows a very simple system that does not care about opinions. It only responds to structure, documentation, and enforceable proof. At the core of every situation like this, there are three layers. First, there are assets, things that either protect you or bring money into your system. A house, for example, is not automatically an asset just because people live inside it. It becomes an asset only when ownership is clearly defined and legally recorded. Second, there are liabilities, things that quietly take money out of your system every month, like mortgages, insurance, maintenance costs, and credit obligations. These do not ask for permission. They simply withdraw value over time. And third, there is cash flow, the invisible workforce of your financial life. Cash flow is what keeps everything moving, paying bills, maintaining stability, and keeping systems alive even when no one is paying attention. The young white American woman understood these layers in a way that confused the people around her. They saw her presence as emotional involvement, but she was tracking structure. She knew which accounts were funding the mortgage, how payment records were distributed, and how liability exposure was being managed through banking systems. She understood that being inside a house does not automatically mean controlling its financial structure. That control lives in documentation, not occupancy. This is where paperwork becomes more powerful than perception. A property deed determines ownership. A bank statement reveals actual cash flow behavior. A title document defines legal authority. A prenup or legal agreement can override emotional assumptions entirely. Even something like camera footage or recorded evidence can shift interpretation into verification when disputes arise. These are not symbolic objects. They are enforceable boundaries in financial systems. They decide who has rights and who only has assumptions. The quiet white billionaire Minter observed this entire structure without interruption. From his perspective, none of this was about conflict. It was about alignment between financial reality and legal documentation. He understood that most disputes are not caused by money itself, but by misunderstanding where money is recorded. In his world, wealth was never measured by presence or emotion. It was measured by whether ownership could survive scrutiny when everything was challenged at once. And that is why evidence matters more than argument. Payment records do not react to pressure. Deeds do not change based on emotion. Bank statements do not adjust themselves to match social narratives. Once these documents exist, they define reality more strongly than any conversation in the room. That is the point where emotional control stops working, because emotion cannot override structure that has already been recorded. In situations like this, people often make the mistake of trying to win through intensity, louder voices, stronger accusations, social pressure. But none of that changes what is already written in legal form. The real shift happens when the documents are finally brought forward and compared against belief. That is when the gap between assumption and reality becomes impossible to ignore. And in this house, that gap was about to become visible in a way no one could talk their way out of anymore. Because somewhere inside a file that had been ignored until now, the actual structure of ownership was already waiting to be read, line by line, without emotion, without interpretation, and without negotiation. The tension in the house did not rise because of shouting anymore. It rose because something unseen had begun to surface, piece by piece, like a system slowly revealing its own architecture. On the kitchen counter, the brown folder that had been ignored earlier was now slightly open, and inside it the edge of a property deed could be seen. Official, stamped, and unmistakably structured in a way that did not rely on anyone's opinion. Nearby, a bank statement lay partially exposed, with a single line subtly circled in red ink, highlighting a financial flow that contradicted the assumptions being made in the room. On the dining table, a smartphone rested face up, paused on a video file that no one had fully acknowledged yet. It was not loud, not dramatic in itself, but it represented something far more powerful than emotion: recorded reality. A few steps away, a lawyer's folder sat closed but visibly present, labeled in a way that suggested custody of legal authority rather than conversation. In another corner of the space, a sealed envelope marked prenup documentation sat untouched, while a small company badge and a set of newly cut keys added another layer of quiet proof that access, ownership, and permission were not aligned the way people assumed. The young white American woman stood near this quiet accumulation of evidence without urgency. She did not try to explain it. She did not raise her voice. She did not attempt to convince anyone who was already committed to misunderstanding her position. Instead, she simply remained still, as if she already understood that documentation does not require performance. Her calmness was not ignorance. It was preparation meeting confirmation. The quiet white billionaire mentor, positioned slightly away from the center of the room, observed all of this with subtle recognition. He had seen this pattern before, not a financial dispute driven by numbers, but a social collapse driven by the sudden visibility of structure. His expression did not change dramatically, but there was a clear shift in understanding. He realized she had not been reacting to the conflict at all. She had been building a record of it. Meanwhile, the opposing side still operated under a completely different assumption. They believed control came from presence, from social alignment, from emotional pressure applied at the right moment. To them, the woman standing quietly among legal documents still appeared outmatched, because they were measuring power through visibility rather than structure. They could not yet see that every object in that room was a different layer of financial authority waiting to be recognized. This is where the lesson becomes unavoidable. People who understand money do not win through volume. They do not win through emotional intensity or public agreement. They win through systems that already exist before conflict begins. Deeds do not argue. Bank records do not negotiate. Legal files do not respond to social pressure. They simply define reality when they are opened. And yet, even as the evidence became more physically present in the room, the situation had not fully shifted. Because there is always a final stage in these conflicts where structure meets resistance, where emotional narratives try to hold on a little longer before being replaced entirely by documentation. That resistance was still forming in the room, coming from family expectations, social judgment, and legal hesitation that had not yet fully activated. What happens next is not about more emotion or louder arguments. It is about what happens when the system itself is officially read aloud, when the quiet records are no longer passive objects on a table, but but active proof inside a legal and financial framework that no one in the room can ignore anymore. The moment the documents became visible in the room, the conflict shifted, but not toward resolution yet. Instead, it escalated into something more familiar in financial disputes involving family, relationships, and perceived authority: pressure. Not legal pressure yet, not verified pressure, but social pressure, the kind that tries to override structure with emotion. The younger white American woman now found herself at the center of multiple overlapping narratives. The family began to speak at once, each voice reinforcing a different version of reality. One person implied she was being unreasonable. Another suggested she was acting out of entitlement. Someone else questioned her intentions entirely, framing her as if she were an outsider trying to claim something she had no right to. The mistress, positioned with calculated confidence, contributed to the emotional framing, reinforcing the idea that the woman standing quietly in the room was unstable or misaligned with what should be accepted. No one in the room was discussing the documents yet. They were still discussing her. This is where financial conflicts often become distorted. When people cannot immediately dispute the paperwork, they begin to attack the person instead. Labels replace analysis. Tone replaces evidence. Reputation becomes a substitute for ownership. And in environments like this, emotional consensus often tries to outrun legal clarity. The quiet white billionaire mentor remained silent, observing how quickly the conversation shifted away from structure and back into perception. He understood this pattern well. In financial disputes, especially those involving property, inheritance, or shared living arrangements, the first response to inconvenient documentation is rarely acceptance. It is reinterpretation. People attempt to reframe the individual holding evidence as someone unqualified to present it. The young woman did not respond to the accusations. She did not defend herself in the way they expected, because she understood something they were still resisting. Responding emotionally to a system that operates legally is always a losing position. Instead, she remained focused on what had already been placed in the room: the deed, the financial records, the legal files that did not depend on anyone's approval to exist. The pressure intensified in a more subtle way. Suggestions were made that she should step back, that she was making things difficult, that cooperation would be more appropriate than confrontation. These phrases are often used in financial environments where power is being questioned but not yet formally corrected. They are not legal arguments. They are social stabilizers, designed to preserve comfort rather than clarify ownership. And beneath all of it is a deeper economic behavior that repeats across situations like this. People will often pay for peace, even when they are entitled to clarity. They will accept financial loss to avoid social discomfort. They will maintain mortgages they do not fully understand just to preserve appearances. They will carry liabilities longer than necessary because stepping away would disrupt how others perceive them. In other words, they trade structure for acceptance. The young woman was no longer participating in that trade. The billionaire mentor recognized this without needing to say it. He had seen people maintain entire financial systems built on external approval rather than internal clarity. And he knew how fragile those systems become the moment documentation enters the conversation. But even now, despite the growing presence of evidence, the situation had not reached its final shift. Because before structure replaces narrative completely, there is always a final resistance point, a moment where emotion, family pressure, and social interpretation attempt one last time to redefine what the documents mean. And that is where the next stage begins, not with more conversation, but with the point where legal interpretation can no longer be delayed, and the system itself is forced to choose between perception and recorded reality. The room finally changed the moment the folder was opened completely, not emotionally, but structurally. The quiet white billionaire mentor stepped forward just enough to acknowledge what everyone else had been avoiding, while the young white American woman remained still, her expression unchanged, as if she already knew exactly what was about to be confirmed. Inside the brown folder, the property deed was now fully visible. Not partial, not implied, complete and legally stamped. The name on the title was not what the loudest voices in the room had assumed. It was written clearly, officially, and without ambiguity. There was no interpretation needed. Ownership, in its most enforceable form, was recorded there in black ink and government validation. The house, the same house that had just been used as a symbol of exclusion, was legally tied to documentation that contradicted every emotional claim made moments earlier. The bank statements were placed beside it, showing payment history that aligned with responsibility, not assumption. Mortgage contributions, insurance payments, and financial transfers were all recorded with timestamps that created a pattern of sustained obligation. The question of who paid was no longer theoretical. It was documented, and documentation does not respond to tone, pressure, or group agreement. The lawyer's file was opened next. This was where the shift became irreversible. Within it were legal confirmations, signatures, and recorded agreements that clarified authority over the property. The prenup reference inside the file confirmed boundaries that had been ignored in conversation, but not in law. The custody-style financial responsibility clauses tied to shared obligations showed exactly who held enforceable rights and who did not. As each page was turned, the energy in the room collapsed into silence. Not the silence of confusion, but the silence of recognition. Because financial truth has a specific effect when it becomes visible, it removes the need for interpretation. The mistress, who had been confident moments earlier, no longer spoke. The family members who had framed the narrative through emotion stopped mid-sentence. Even the earlier accusations, words like entitled, unstable, or unqualified, lost their weight the moment the documents contradicted them. No one needed to argue anymore. The quiet white billionaire minter finally spoke, not to escalate, but to clarify the principle that had been visible from the beginning. His voice was calm, precise, and almost detached from the emotional collapse in the room. He said, "In finance, what is written survives what is said. Everything else is just noise until the record is read." That sentence settled the room more than any confrontation ever could. Because what just happened was not a victory of personality, emotion, or social alignment. It was the reassertion of structure over assumption. The deed defined ownership. The bank records defined responsibility. The legal file defined authority. And none of those systems required permission from anyone in the room to be valid. What remained was not debate, it was consequence. And as the implications began to settle, it became clear that the next stage would no longer be about proving what was true. It would be about what happens when truth is already confirmed, legally recognized, and impossible to reverse through conversation alone. The legal and financial consequences did not arrive as a dramatic explosion. They arrived as procedure. Calm, structured, and irreversible. Once the deed, payment history, and legal file were fully reviewed, the attorney present in the situation confirmed what the documents had already been saying from the beginning. Ownership was not a matter of opinion, and access was not a matter of emotion. It was a matter of recorded authority. The first practical shift was administrative. The house keys, previously treated as symbols of control, were reclassified according to legal entitlement. When the ownership records were verified, the lock system was changed in accordance with standard property protection protocol. It was not done out of revenge or emotion. It was done because the legal structure required alignment between access and title. The individuals who did not appear on the ownership documentation no longer had enforceable access rights. Next came the financial confirmation. The bank was contacted, and the statements that had already been reviewed in private were officially validated. Payment histories, account contributions, and liability tracking were all confirmed as accurate records of responsibility. There was no ambiguity left for interpretation. The institution did not respond to the emotional narrative in the room. It responded only to account structure and verified authorization. In parallel, the legal file was escalated for formal recognition. The court system, when presented with the documentation, did not evaluate tone, intention, or family dynamics. It evaluated signatures, timestamps, and compliance with contract law. Once those elements were confirmed, the agreement stood as enforceable structure. Whatever narrative had been built around entitlement or assumption could not override recorded legal fact. The outcome was not chaotic. It was orderly. The house remained intact, but the control structure around it had been corrected. Those whose names were not on the title or agreements gradually lost practical authority over decisions involving the property. Access, financial input, and decision-making power all realigned to match legal ownership. What had been assumed through presence was now defined by documentation. The people who had relied on emotional authority began to realize a difficult truth. Participation in a household does not automatically translate into ownership within a financial system. Contribution, in itself, does not equal legal control unless it is recorded and recognized within enforceable structure. The young white American woman did not celebrate. She did not escalate the situation or turn it into personal victory. She simply allowed the system to speak for itself. The quiet white billionaire mentor observed the outcome without surprise. For him, this was not an exceptional event. It was simply the natural result of documentation finally being read correctly. Before leaving the situation fully behind, he offered one final observation, not as advice, but as a financial principle distilled into plain language. If your name is not on the structure, your emotions cannot add it there. Only records decide what belongs to you. From a practical standpoint, the aftermath became a checklist of financial clarity rather than conflict. Keep your documents organized. Understand exactly whose name is on the title before assuming control. Track where money actually moves, not where it is believed to move. Protect accounts with verified authority, not informal access. Never confuse emotional contribution with legal ownership. And most importantly, never allow social pressure to replace documented proof. When financial stakes are involved, these are not aggressive rules. They are stabilizing ones. They exist to prevent confusion from turning into loss. And yet, even after everything had been resolved in structural terms, one final shift remained unresolved, not in the house, but in identity itself. Because once someone sees how easily perception collapses in front of documentation, they cannot return to the same way of understanding money, ownership, and control. And that realization leads into the final question. Who do you become after you stop trusting appearance and start trusting only what is written, verified, and enforceable? By the time everything had settled, what remained was no longer a conflict between people. It was a clear separation between perception and understanding. The house stood in the same physical space, unchanged in structure, but everything around its meaning had shifted. Ownership, authority, and responsibility were no longer topics of debate. They were defined, recorded, and enforced through systems that did not depend on emotion to function. The young white American woman no longer appeared like someone defending herself. There was nothing left to defend. The documents had already done that work. What changed was not her situation, but how it was interpreted by everyone who had mistaken silence for absence of power. In reality, her silence had never been emptiness. It had been alignment with structure. She had not been reacting to instability. She had been operating within documentation the entire time. The quiet white billionaire mentor remained in the background of the situation, but his presence now felt less like observation and more like confirmation of a principle that had been proven once again. He had seen many versions of this before, situations where people believed control came from visibility, from emotional dominance, or from social agreement. Yet every time, the outcome was the same. Systems always default back to recorded structure, not perceived authority. He did not need to elaborate further. The outcome had already said enough. The lesson that emerged was not about conflict, but about identity and financial reality. People who truly understand money do not rely on noise to establish their position. They do not need to argue, exaggerate, or perform certainty. Their proof exists in quieter places, in property titles, in bank statements, in signed agreements, in documented cash flow, and in the discipline to maintain systems without letting emotion override structure. This is the difference that most people only recognize when it is too late to ignore it. Looking in control is not the same as being in control. Looking wealthy is not the same as having protected assets. Speaking confidently about ownership is not the same as having your name on the deed. And feeling entitled to something has no weight when compared to legally recorded reality. The young woman had learned this distinction not through theory, but through exposure. She now understood how easily people can attempt to use emotion as a substitute for documentation, and how quickly that approach collapses when structure is finally enforced. Her understanding of money was no longer tied to appearances or assumptions. It was tied to systems that could be verified. The billionaire's presence in her path was not about rescue. It was about clarity. He represented a type of financial awareness that does not engage in emotional conflict because it operates above it. For him, wealth was never about proving anything to others. It was about ensuring that every layer of ownership, liability, and cash flow was aligned with reality, not perception. And that is where the final identity shift becomes unavoidable. Once you understand how quickly emotion fails in the face of documentation, you cannot unsee it. You begin to recognize how many decisions in life are made to maintain appearances rather than protect structure. You start to notice how often people pay with money, stability, or peace simply to avoid being questioned by others. And you realize that most financial vulnerability does not come from lack of income, but from lack of clarity about ownership. In the end, nothing about the situation required loud resolution. It resolved itself through structure already in place. And the final truth remains simple, but permanent. Do not build a life that depends on convincing others you have power. Build a life where power is already recorded, protected, and enforceable without you ever needing to raise your voice.